Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session on carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Since the three of us planned this session about 2 weeks ago, there's been changed circumstances, and in particular, the Prove It Act was introduced 2 or 3 days ago. So we're going to do some, we did a little planning, but also a little bit of ad-libbing as we go forward here. So I want to do a little check-in on where people are at with their CBAM knowledge goals. So who here, raise your hand if this is the first time, your first deep dive on CBAMs? Okay, good. Please raise your hand if you are looking to increase your expertise in a way that will allow you to make the Prove It Act an ask for your senator. Okay, good. And then, how many of you are here and have a running conversation with your member of Congress on CBAMs? Okay, few. Who here are looking for more information on the EU CBAM? Okay, excellent. And then who here is interested in questions about competitiveness with other countries? Okay, lots. Okay, so I'm liking that. We'll just go with our game plan. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to make this impromptuly a training session for the Prove It Act. So what we will do is we will do our introductions, and then Katrina will do her magnificent presentation on what a CBAM, that's a lot of words to say it, what a CBAM is in general. And then Shuting will do a presentation on the Prove It Act. We'll do our ordinary citizens climate lobby activity of pairing up and practicing our ask on the Prove It Act. And then we will take questions and answers that will help you make that ask, okay? So I'll introduce myself last, but if we can maybe just go down the line here and do some intros.
Hi, all. I'm Katrina Rourke. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council. I'm also the Executive Director of our Center for Climate and Trade. I've been working on a carbon price with a border adjustment for about 15 years now. And in recent years, we haven't won yet. And I've spent the last 3 years or so really diving deep on this concept of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, border carbon adjustment. We'll use some different language to talk about that notion today because it has been sort of rising in ascendancy in the political conversation.
And just one follow-up, what's your climate hook? Why do you work on climate so hard?
I started working on climate by accident. I did a rotation to the office of Representative Bob Inglis. And he asked me to write a domestic carbon pricing bill, which was a totally foreign concept. I came to him from a budget office at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so I climbed that learning curve as fast as I could. It was a really interesting idea to just apply a very elegant solution to the biggest environmental problem of our day, and he made me drink the Kool-Aid. So here I am after all these years.
Thank you, Bob Inglis.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shuting Parmerlo. I'm a research manager of climate policy with the Niskanen Center. My research interests include carbon taxation, carbon border adjustments, and policies at the intersection of climate and trade. I've written a few reports and commentaries on the EU CBAM and what's a CBAM and why it's important, and I'm very excited about the discussion today.
And what's your hook on climate? And what keeps you working on climate so hard?
Yes, so I studied energy and environmental policies when I was at grad school at the Georgetown University, and I think it's a very meaningful and important policy area. the challenges I see in the climate space is there are a lot of excellent ideas or policies with very good intentions, very ambitious goals, but sometimes the policies are not really well designed, so they might have some unintended goals. So what keeps me going is really be that analyst and resource for policymakers in this town. And hey, like if you have an idea, here are the pros, here are the cons. If you decide to go forward, what would be some of the potential trade-offs? And I think that's what keeps me going, and maybe weed out some of the bad policies in this space.
All right, thank you. And I'm Ross Astoria. I think many of you know me. For my day job, I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin at Parkside, which is about halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee. I've been a citizen climate lobbyist since 2011. I got a phone call out of the blue one spring from Madeline, and she said, hey, we're going to DC to lobby on climate. And we had a nice long conversation about this, and I walked away from the conversation thinking, that's crazy. So I went to my wife, and I asked her permission to go to DC and do this, and she said yes. And I've been kind of hooked since then. In the past 12 years, I have had the honor of serving as the liaison to Paul Ryan's office, and I have been pro bono policy advisor for Citizens Climate Lobby, in which capacity I helped write the ICTA Act, and I now am on the board of directors. So welcome everybody to Citizens Climate Lobby. And I guess my climate hook, what keeps me going is I really enjoy solving hard problems with clever, dedicated people. So thank you. Let's get underway here. Katrina's got 7 minutes or so of material about CBAMs, and then we'll get to Shu-Ting and the Prove It Act, and then we'll see how things are feeling, but I think at that point we'll divide into our exercise and see how it goes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. I promised 7 minutes. I talk fast. If I talk too fast, I'm happy to address any questions, but let's buckle up. Okay, what is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, border carbon adjustment? Strictly speaking, it is intended to normalize at the border the domestic treatment of carbon emissions so that all imports face the same carbon fee as any goods produced domestically. In the WTO parlance, a border adjustment is adjusting for an internal indirect tax. A tax on goods is what that means. And so, strictly speaking, we have never been actually talking about a carbon border adjustment. We have been talking about pricing carbon at the border. Within the Citizens Climate Lobby history, certainly you all are familiar with what it looks like when you tack a border carbon adjustment onto a domestic carbon price, adjust for that price at the border. The European Union is exploring something similar right now. Their carbon border adjustment mechanism adjusts for imports so that those imports will eventually pay what domestic producers will pay under their emissions trading scheme. So this is an adjustment at the border for like treatment of imported and domestically produced products. What we're seeing happen in the conversation in DC, but also at the G7, also amongst capitals across the world, is an evolution of thinking that a border adjustment isn't just a way to get imported goods and domestic goods paying the same carbon fee, but to impose a system of accountability at the border for particularly emissions-intensive manufacturing abroad. And I want to talk to you about that evolution because it's one of the motivating factors behind the Prove It Act. So, I'm going to go over my 7 minutes because that was too much of preamble, but y'all are fine with that. Okay, so the political conversation is what's gotten us to this point, to think about a border adjustment as a standalone idea. And there are, I think, 4 primary factors that go into that. One is the carbon advantage. We'll be able to show you a slide from an analysis that we did at the Climate Leadership Council that demonstrates that the US is a carbon efficient manufacturer across industries, especially compared to our major trading partners. That's an advantage that already exists in the US manufacturing system because of private sector investments in efficiency, terrific best practices, policies at all levels of government, including subsidies, the emissions trading system in California, you bet it. Here is the summary. And this is what the Prove It Act, I didn't have the more detailed table, did I? Can I click through? So we pulled up the slides from last year thinking that while we're calling an audible on the Prove It Act, we might have. No, that's it, okay. If you can pull up that one slide again, sorry for ruining your tee up. Yes, that one. And so what we were able to demonstrate is that this carbon advantage already exists. US manufacturers are already leading the world in carbon efficiency. We don't have a mechanism to credit them for that. There's a tremendous amount of capital investment that goes into having a carbon advantage. There is no system that credits them for that, especially against foreign competitors. Motivation number 2 is the carbon loophole. A lot of major strategic supply chains are dominated by countries like China and Russia that have particularly high emissions profiles. Thinking about particularly Russia oil and natural gas exports, thinking about particularly China's presence in the critical and strategic minerals arena, in solar cells. They dominate these supply chains and have very high carbon intensities associated with these productions relative to the United States, Europe, other partners. And so that carbon loophole is a concern. Those emissions are unpriced. What we understand today is that roughly 25% of global emissions are associated with internationally traded goods, and we don't have a mechanism to encourage the Chinas and the Russias of the world to start decarbonizing those supply chains for the globe's benefit. Motivation number 3, geopolitics. I've already brought up Russia and China. They deeply understand the motivations behind the European CBAM, what we're considering in the US on a standalone approach, as damaging to their economy. Indeed, Russia's oil czar, Igor Sechin, has said that the European CBAM would be more damaging to the Russian economy than economic sanctions designed to be damaging to the Russian economy. And a university in China did an analysis of the impact of the European CBAM, and it found that just the European CBAM would cost China 0.64 percentage points of GDP and 2.3 million manufacturing jobs. These are really powerful geopolitical tools that will allow us to sort of reorient power structures in these important supply chains. And then the 4th motivation is shorthand, increase manufacturing, save the world. If the US makes more of these goods at home because we have a lower emissions profile, we'll be able to lower in aggregate the global emissions associated with really important supply chains like steel and aluminum and cement and the things that will build a low carbon future. If we can make more of those things at home and encourage the decarbonization of those supply chains abroad, it'll be easier to decarbonize and it'll be easier to have the lowest emissions profile possible as we do that. We're not going to get rid of these emissions intensive supply chains, so we need to optimize them. Moving parts. I referenced the European CBAM. This fall, they're going to start imposing a reporting requirement so that imports of iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminum, electricity, and hydrogen will have to report on their carbon intensity. Sometime next month, we believe, we'll see the regulations that will tell importers how to report on that carbon intensity. So as you can imagine, this is moving really fast. Importers know that starting in October, they're gonna have to start submitting paperwork, and they don't even know what that paperwork looks like yet. Fast moving. The US is in negotiations with the European Union on the global arrangement for sustainable steel and aluminum. That would be the first sort of climate club of its kind, attempting to reduce the carbon intensity of traded steel and aluminum products and address non-market excess capacity globally in those supply chains, which is a substantial driver of excess emissions. It's another moving part. Third moving part is that the G7 conversation is increasingly considering what these tools look like to work together on trade instruments that will reduce the carbon intensity of globally traded products. Their Clean Energy Economy Action Plan that they released, what was that summit, was 4 weeks ago maybe? So readout from the G7 progress on this concept of collaborating together in that forum on trade tools to address the carbon intensity of traded goods. Other things shaping the conversation, I'll just throw them out. Supply chain security, how do we make sure that we've got access to the necessary supply chains to decarbonize? That includes the heavy stuff, steel and aluminum, but also the things we need just a little bit of, like lithium and cobalt. Emerging markets, and how do we orient them towards trading with us? These are important sources of supply chain materials, important destinations for US innovated products. And so we want to strengthen trade ties with emerging markets. This might be a really terrific lever to pull to do so. And then running in the background constantly is outcompeting China. China has a series of 5-year plans to orient their economy for global dominance in a whole lot of sectors, many of them associated with decarbonization technologies and critical supply chains. How do we address those concerns that we have about our security in an environment in which China is pouring dollars into this? Well, maybe this climate and trade angle is going to be helpful for US security over the long run. I threw a tremendous amount at you, but just think about this as the context behind the Prove It Act. Why are members of Congress asking the questions behind the Prove It Act? It's because of this really fast evolving situation, orienting towards a climate and trade angle, defining the next century of global trade.
All right, thank you. So thank you, Katrina. I didn't mention how I think might be the best way to take questions. This is an even larger crowd than I expected. So how about we get through the exercise where we practice our Prove It Act and register questions as you're doing that exercise, and then we'll swing back and the rest will be Q&A. Ricky, are we doing with the okay, and write down your questions and then we'll collect them and do, all right. Shooting, you're up.
Thanks, Katrina, for the wonderful quick overview of such a large policy space with so many important topics that we need to really pay attention to and figure out over the next few years. I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of the Prove It Act, which was introduced by Senator Coons and Senator Kramer last week. I wrote a commentary about 1,000 words, diving into, what's in the bill and what are some of the implications of the bill. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to the Niskanen Center website. I think it's due on the main page there. Before I go into the details of what's the Prove It Act, Katrina just now, she gave us a wonderful introduction of what's a carbon border adjustment, how it's related to a carbon tax, and the EU is implementing its own quote-unquote carbon border adjustment starting from October this year, starting to collect data. Now, I want to take a quick step back and explain to you all why it's critical to look at emissions at the product level. So border adjustment is actually not something novel. It's being used in other types of taxes, like the value-added tax, excise taxes like alcohol or tobacco taxes. With border adjustment in other types of taxes, it's very straightforward. You just need to look at the sales prices of a certain product, and it's very easy to calculate the tax liability. But it's a completely different story when we come to the carbon intensity of a specific product, because when I look at this pen or this bottle of water, I don't necessarily know the total emissions embedded in the production process that's used to produce this specific product. That's why the Prove It Act is transforming and very critical step, in my opinion, in the US history for climate action, if it becomes law. So rather than looking at emissions at the facility or national or a company level, the Prove It Act specifically asks DOE, Department of Energy, to do a carbon intensity study on several products' emissions, so at the product level. There are several types of products included, typical carbon-intensive primary goods like aluminum, steel, iron. There are also fossil fuels products such as natural gas and crude oil. There are also other types of products like the clean energy technology products like solar panels and wind turbines. So the bill is asking DOE to work with a whole bunch of agencies, including Department of Commerce, EPA, USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, and the Department of State to work together doing such a study on carbon intensity. The timeline of the study is after the law passes, they need to complete the study within 2 years. In my opinion, that's very ambitious, that there's a lot of work to be done because the study is not only looking at the US, but a list of other countries, including members of G7 and a country that has a free trade agreement with the US, a certain country of concerns, for example, China, Russia, also any other country that holds a certain market share of some of the products. So I talked about products, agency coverage, and the timeline, and also when they talk about carbon intensity, the concept I want to explain quickly here, they mean the total emissions per unit of output. So it could be per ton of steel or per $100 market value of steel produced. And the carbon emissions, they're looking at the total emissions, including any inputs that go into the production processes of making intermediary or final goods. So they're looking at all the emissions that would go into the production process. So I talk about what's in the bill. Based on my understanding, and the Washington Post, they had a fantastic article last week reporting the bill, and they had some interviews with the senators that introduced and co-sponsored the bill. So according to my understanding of reading the Washington Post article, I think this is a first step for these senators to levying carbon tariffs. They want to leverage the US's carbon advantage, make foreign polluters pay for their exports like China and Russia. So it seems to me that's their goal. And should I talk about what I think would be the implications of this bill, or should I stick with? Implication, okay, thanks Ross. So that's the goal from my understanding, and I want to make a very quick distinction here, and I look forward to discussing more about this. So there's a clear distinction between what is a carbon tariff and carbon border adjustment. Carbon border adjustment is you have to have a domestic carbon tax in the US paired with an import tax and export rebate at the same rate as the domestic tax. That's a carbon border adjustment. Tariffs, my understanding is only the import side, so fees on imported goods, like the Section 232, Trump's tariffs that he put on imports of steel and aluminum coming from China and the EU and the rest of the world. So there's a clear distinction between tariffs and carbon border adjustment. So basically, well, I think the implication of this bill is, first, the bill in it of itself is an excellent first step in the climate actions towards collecting product level emissions. It will be critical to decarbonization and implementing a lot of climate policies. Depending on how Congress decides to use the bill for, if it decides to use the product level emissions data for a border adjusted carbon tax, then I think we would be on the right track to decarbonization. But if they do decide to use it for enacting unilateral carbon tariffs, then there might be some problems and challenges, which I can go into in a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, we're about 25 minutes in. I'd like us to get ready for our exercise. A couple things I'd like to remind everybody. So the Prove It Act is only in the Senate. So right now, if you're going to do an ask on the Prove It Act, keep it to the Senate side. The second is permitting reform is our primary ask. So as you're putting together your meeting plans, think carefully about how much energy and attention you want to give to the Prove It Act vis-a-vis permitting. That said, I think this is a pretty straightforward ask for most senators of either party who are interested in border carbon adjustments. So here's the exercise. We're going to pair up. This is our typical thing. I'd like you to spend 1 minute, I'm going to time us, 1 minute introducing yourselves, making a new friend, and then I will break us, and we'll 2 minutes, one of that new pair will give the ask for the Prove It Act, and then I'll ring the bell, and we'll take 2 minutes, the other of the pair doing the ask, and register questions and concerns as you do the activity, and then we'll see how it goes. All right, 1 minute starting now.
I just don't want to pair up with anybody. They already tried to get me to pair up. It's smart, I like it, but... Yeah. It was good. I got some pictures.
On one hand, it's got this like ridiculously technical and boring background to it, but then once you press on all the details, you get into some of the most interesting questions of international political economy.
Yeah.
We're looking at a lot of smart questions.
Yeah. It was good. How did you wind up talking about the Prove It Act? I didn't realize you were doing that.
I volunteered.
Did you?
Okay, friends and colleagues. Friends and colleagues, I'm sorry to cut off your discussion with your new friend. I'm sorry to cut off the discussion with your new friend. But you get to work with that friend a little more now. So first member of the pair, please take 2 minutes to practice the Prove It Ask with your senator. Please begin now.
Council line. Okay. Also, if you want to, we've updated the primary ask page with the Prove It Act stuff, so you can just tell people if they go to community and look for the primary ask page, that all the information for the Prove It Act and what we're asking for will already be included there. So, yeah, it's already ready, isn't it? It's crazy. Thanks, guys.
table. That's a great table. Can you give it to the person in the back? Okay, friends and colleagues, your senator has got to run off to her next meeting. Please switch roles. The second person is now doing the ask, and the first person is the senator. Please begin.
Hey friends, I'm on the next one. I'm talking permitting.
Wait, is that right after?
Yeah. How's it going? Good.
I thought you
How are you guys?
because of us.
Of course. Of course. Good. Nice weather. How about you?
Yeah, sorry. I hid out because I have asthma.
Ah,
Smoke gets maybe.
AQI. It was mostly better over the weekend, right?
Saturday was alright.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, yesterday was bad.
It was like yellow.
Oh man.
We watched the Lego movie.
Is it out already? Is there
Sounds
some
fun.
new one? Is there? Maybe I make that.
I love like basically all of them.
There's a new Mario.
Yeah, I did not see that.
That was quite disappointing.
Yeah.
Okay, I fell asleep.
Maybe it's hard to beat the 90s Mario
They
Brothers
could have
movie.
put more effort.
Very good.
But it was the old the TV show.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? The show?
Super Mario Brothers show.
Yeah. It was like a Saturday morning show, and it was like part live action, part cartoon.
Is that good?
I mean, I was a kid, so I don't know. I liked it. Old school. Alright.
Corey's there.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, Corey's right there. The one trying to avoid being in
Surreptitiously text.
All right, thank you. Thank you, friends. Let's go ahead and everyone's very excited. That makes me happy. Katrina, did you ever think you'd see this much excitement over CBAM discussions?
I'm very glad to see it, Ross.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, let's. So I've been reminded to direct you to our community page, and the one pager for the Prove It Act is up there, so you can find it there, and it's a resource for you, as well as the Niskanen Center's blog from shooting. Let's go ahead and jump right into questions. Yeah, any comments? Yeah, let's just jump into questions. We got 25 minutes. Let's see what we can do. There's lots of cars up.
Thank you for all that. So one question is, how would a tariff, a carbon tariff, stand up with World Trade Organization rules?
We'll have two different answers. Why don't you start? Shooting?
3.
No, what you want me to start? Okay. That's an excellent question. I'm glad you asked so I can follow up on my talking point earlier. My short answer is it won't stand up really well with the WTO organization. So one of the key principles of WTO rules is non-discriminatory. We need to treat all trading partners the same. And it just doesn't really make sense that we would put carbon tariffs on imported products when there's not a domestic carbon price in the United States, whether that's a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. So it would definitely violate the WTO rules. There are exceptions to levying trade policies to protect the environment and the health and the the planet, I think that's the Article 20, but I would say the bar is really high. They really look at every single penny coming out of the policy and see if you're really using all that money for environmental protection or climate change purposes. So my short answer is it would only make sense to have a domestic carbon price in the US before we look at any carbon border adjustments or carbon tariffs.
Ready for a different answer? So I like to say that the carbon border adjustment of a domestic carbon fee could walk in through the front door of the WTO. That means not rely on the environmental exceptions that Xuting just alluded to. It could comport with all of the existing law at the WTO. The standalone mechanism would have to go through the environmental exception. The environmental exceptions are pretty broad. And so this is certainly related to an exhaustible natural resource, which is a healthy climate. And so therefore would qualify for an environmental exception. And then you have to do a couple of things. You have to make sure that you're not discriminating between countries. So how do we treat China the same way we treat Germany? Well, if we're charging based on the carbon intensity of a good that they produce, then we're treating goods from those countries exactly the same way, even if they pay a different amount at the border. That we don't have a domestic carbon price certainly raises a question of whether this would be a true environmental policy. And so what we would need to do is substantiate to the WTO and to our partners that this is indeed related to an environmental question, that this is a significant attempt to address global emissions. And all the numbers suggest that it sure would be. If the US is able to get our imports on a par with our domestic intensity, we could cut our own emissions 600 million tons per year. If we did that with our G7 partners, we could cut global emissions 1.8 billion tons per year. That's more than 5% of all global emissions, and it's just with this trade policy. So certainly an environmental exception to existing rules, this could be captured under that. Therefore, I think that even a standalone attempt to price carbon at the border could pass muster with the WTO. However, the WTO does not have an appellate body, and so if it does not pass muster with the WTO, there's nobody to tell us to stop.
I would like to respond to Katrina's points very quickly, if I may, if you're all interested. Yes, okay. I think Katrina makes some points. I definitely hear her. I agree that there is an WTO exemption rule that might allow you to do certain things if the goal is to protect the environment and address climate change. Now, at the Niskanen Center, we've actually thought about that. We've actually thought about using that approach, but we're really not sure how that would work because to comply with the WTO rules, the very key is you need to make sure that you're not charging imported goods any amount that's higher than you're charging the domestic goods produced by domestic producers. If there's not a domestic carbon tax in the United States, carbon price, cap and trade or carbon tax, I'm not sure how much we would be advocating for the carbon tariffs, the imported fees. So we spent a lot of time talking about CBAM, and I gave it a quick overview of Prove It Act. So we would need to figure out two parts, two multipliers. The first is the emissions amount associated, say, with this bottle of product, right? That is emissions. We are on our way to figuring that part out. The second multiplier is the carbon price. How many dollars per ton of emissions are you charging? So if we don't have a domestic carbon price in the US, we would have to come up with a justification to say, these are perhaps the environmental regulations, higher environmental standards. We might need to charge $50, $100 on per ton of emissions. We'll need to go into explaining that to all our trading partners, whether that's our allies, our friends, or a country of concern, like, hey, we're charging you $100 per ton. And you'll need to back yourself into a corner to really justify that. And then it's really difficult to explain and justify that at a product level, like this pen or this bottled water, that you're not really charging amount that's higher on foreign producers, say in China, than a producer in Arizona. So that's one. My second response is to the WTO non-functioning appellate body. I personally think that's very sad and unfortunate. It's part of the US's fault because we kept blocking appointing judges to the appellate body. But I think it makes it so much more critical and important to comply with WTO rules, because if we were to enact uniform carbon tariffs, other countries retaliate. They just impose tariffs on the most important US exports to other countries. There won't be a functioning body to arbitrate, so they can just retaliate and they can do whatever they want. So I think it's important for the US to keep a leading position and set an example, like we play by the rules, free market, open economy, we are pro-trade, trade with reasonable countries, friends and allies, not necessarily anyone like Katrina talked about economic sanctions on Russia. So we want to stick with the WTO rules that have been very critical in facilitating international and global trade to the economic growth and prosperity of the whole world. And I see Ross.
Oh,
Yeah,
I thought
that's my response. Thank you.
Okay, and then one final answer. Go ahead. All right, and then one final answer from me. In the context of the Prove It Act, I don't think you need to talk about the WTO at all. The Prove It Act directs the DOE to quantify America's carbon advantage. In that quantification, no trade law is implicated. So Senator blah, 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 you can sign on to this bill and worry about trade law issues later. So, cool, we got a lot of technical stuff going on there. You might have that conversation with your senator, but maybe you don't need to have it. So, John, what do we got?
Yeah, another question. What to say to a progressive skeptic of the Prove It Act who worries this is a way to avoid a domestic carbon tax?
Can I ask for that browser window, the table to be pulled up? So the Prove It Act is not about imposing a new instrument at the border. The Prove It Act is to give the United States a data foundation to understand how our carbon intensity for manufacturing compares to other countries who we engage in trade with for important commodities like steel and aluminum, like decarbonization technologies. That data foundation doesn't presently exist. We do a really great job of collecting emissions data from facilities or from countries, but we don't have internationally held accounting norms to take those emissions and associate them with individual goods. I alluded before to a study that the Climate Leadership Council did to quantify our carbon advantage. And what we did was we studied the relative carbon intensity of production in economic sectors across countries. This is a sampling of the data that we pulled. And you'll see we indexed it, so the US is one. If it's a red box, that country is more carbon intensive than the US. Blue box, less carbon intensive. White box, about the same. The Prove It Act is going to do this. The Department of Energy is going to work with partners in US government, in industry, and in capitals around the world to do this on a goods level so that we have the data foundation necessary to do whatever it is that we do. And that may include a border adjustment of an internal carbon price. It may include entering into a climate club or other arrangement. It may include very simply just data exchange with other countries. But that data foundation doesn't exist. The Prove It Act will enable that data foundation to come to fruition from the best data keepers on planet Earth at the Department of Energy.
Okay. If we did have a carbon tariff without a domestic carbon price, how would the price of that tariff be set?
I have the same question for Christina. This is the same point I made just now.
So there are a couple of ways to do this. And my colleague Zan is in the back. He actually authored a paper that has perspective on some alternative pathways than just $1 per ton at the border. You can do it in several different ways. So you can create an arbitrary price if you wish. You can just say, that'll be $40, please. You can create a performance standard. How does the US perform in that goods category? If you are more carbon intensive than the US, then you'll pay a fee, either dollars per ton or as a percentage of the goods value. You can also tabulate the regulatory costs that a manufacturer in the US would face to produce that good at the federal and state level and figure out what a sort of equivalent carbon price would be. There are no shortage of mechanisms to use. You can also use what the United States presently does on imports of steel and aluminum from all but a handful of countries. We just have a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum. Imagine converting that into a carbon intensity standard so that that percentage tariff goes up the more carbon intensive the good is. There are a whole variety of ways to do this that we're only beginning to understand because we've finally seen the political conversation disentangle the border adjustment from a domestic fee. And so there are many pathways, only some of them presently known.
Yeah, I was trying to get one more question.
I asked Ross's permission to ask something very quickly, so I'll talk really fast so we can get 1 to 2 more questions. I have some responses to how to think about setting the price for carbon tariffs. I think we need to keep in mind that it's really critical to recognize that the carbon tariffs or carbon border adjustment, well-designed carbon border adjustment with the carbon tax, there's very little we could do to impact the world's biggest polluters' emissions. I'll give you some numbers. Most of the world's biggest polluters, China, India, Russia, Japan, Germany, the US, the EU, a majority of their emissions are for domestic consumption. They only export about 20 to 30% of their emissions for foreign consumption. So 20% of China's emissions are for foreign consumption. So in the year of 2018, all of the United States imports from China accounted for only 4% of China's total emissions. So I think there's a limit to how this climate and trade policy could achieve in terms of geopolitical goals, because they only export a very small percentage of their emissions. A majority of the emissions reductions or decarbonization will have to be driven from their domestic policies. My second response is a carbon tariff without a domestic carbon price won't provide incentives for the US producers to further decarbonize. So I think US lawmakers is really critical for them to keep in mind that we need to really focus on well-designed domestic policies. Yes, we have a bunch of tax breaks, tax subsidies from the IRA, but that's not enough. There's still a long way to go, and I'm sure Katrina will agree with me on this. And we need to focus on efficient and effective policies. And lastly, I would say that there seems to be this narrative that there's a new interest or momentum behind carbon tariffs. I'm talking about tariffs, not border adjustment as a component of carbon tax, and something that might get renewed interest or be passed in Congress. But I would like to point out that the Trump tariffs, it was put in place by the president through the Section 232 with executive power. So it was never passed through Congress, and I'm not really sure how we'll get there or if it will be passed by Congress, but I guess we'll see.
Cool. I'm just going to draw this back to the Prove It Act real quickly. So I'm thinking I have a goal to walk away from the Senate with enough co-sponsors to pass the bill through the Senate. So I am thinking about the Prove It Act right now. So Katrina mentioned a number of what I would call proxy techniques for identifying a carbon price. The Prove It Act provides the data sets we would need in order to make reliable proxy sets. All right, let's do the next question from John back there.
What would you say to a member of Congress who says they don't support tariffs because they just increase prices for American consumers?
I would say, great, I agree. tariffs are regressive, and if we're just doing tariffs on imported goods without any domestic component, without an export rebate, I'm not sure that that would be a good idea. It will have administrative, legal, and economic challenges.
There's a sort of a growing interest in using trade policy to accomplish other domestic goals. And so this concern about tariffs having cost consequences is something that we certainly should grapple with. But for many who are coming to this border adjustment or carbon tariff conversation, the motivation is not related to climate at all. It's related to domestic job creation and supply chain security. And so those motivations have, in our polling, proven to be enormously salient with the electorate, even to the point that we see a majority of Trump-leaning Republicans okay with paying more for domestically produced lower carbon goods because those are American jobs. And in all my years working on carbon pricing, I have never seen a willingness to pay hit majority numbers in a poll. And so the motivation behind these policies, the reason that these policies are becoming increasingly discussed in the Senate, and I think we'll see emerging in the House and certainly in this White House, has a little bit to do with climate, but a lot to do with these additional collateral benefits and our ability to talk about manufacturing jobs, supply chain security, national security, investing in the United States. Those messages are enormously relevant. And I'll just add, while I brought us to the subject, those motivations can have climate co-benefits. And so if a member of Congress is going to come to this issue because they care about manufacturing jobs in the Rust Belt, they care about more investments in American manufacturing, that is as valid a reason for us to leverage for climate purposes as any. It doesn't need to be climate that brings members to the table.
Does the Prove It Act require that the data that's gathered be updated over time?
Yes, it requires DOE to update it every 5 years.
You're supposed to talk for like 10 minutes while I sort through these questions.
We are patient, friend.
Is there a way that the Prove It Act would benefit constituents that we can talk about?
So one of the things, so I work at the Climate Leadership Council. We're a sort of a policy and analysis group, think tank. We have a partner who does political advocacy work. They do a lot of polling and Grasstop's work, and that kind of exposure to non-climate motivations for entering this space has helped me think through this a lot. And so that's the hat I have on in addressing this question. It is a winning narrative that American manufacturers do it better. That gets plenty of constituencies to the table, looking for tools that may have climate benefits that will reward this manufacturing facility down the street where my cousin's worked his whole life. And that's why this conversation about a standalone border approach to monetize our carbon advantage is so resonant with so many in the political conversation. The Prove It Act itself imposes no new instrument. It is only the data foundation to start thinking about what these trade approaches might look like, but it does allow us to continue that narrative that America does it better and cleaner, and that we should have policies that allow us to leverage that the American worker is an engine of global decarbonization. That's a really important message for members to bring home.
I would add quickly that I think using the Prove It Act as a hook is a tremendously great opportunity to talk to your members about the importance of having that as a data foundation for a domestic carbon tax with border adjustment. I think praising what great work this bill has done, but also emphasizing that really for the bill to make impact that is long-lasting, that would make sense for this country's long-term climate action would really have to be a domestic carbon tax with border adjustment, not import tariffs.
What kind of concerns can we expect to hear from members of Congress about the Prove It Act? What might lead them to resist the act or not want to get on board supporting it?
I think it might be, the concern might be, has to do with businesses' privacy, their data privacy, because it really gets down to looking at the emissions of product level. But I'm sure Katrina would agree that we've been doing a lot of voluntary emissions reporting at the corporate level. Companies with a strategic vision, they already mapped out their carbon footprint, set their internal carbon emission reduction goals, and they're enthusiastic about getting there. So I think that shouldn't be much of a concern, yeah.
Yeah, no macro concerns come to mind. Maybe they don't believe that the U.S. has a carbon advantage. Well, we sure do. And building the data tools to prove that'll be great. Micro concerns like data privacy may come up, but the bill is designed with confidential business information in mind. And so what gets reported out by DOE at the end of this process is average carbon intensity for goods by country. So no one facility or manufacturer would be singled out.
Cool. See if we can get one more question in.
Yeah, so if the Prove It Act were to pass after, let's say, 2 years, where would the U.S. be in its understanding of carbon intensity compared to the EU? How far ahead of us are they at this point?
Dramatically far ahead. The U.S. is starting with a more robust data collection and reporting foundation. If you want to figure out what the emissions profile of the United States looks like, there are a multitude of public-facing tools that you can use to take government data and interact with it. The European Union does not have that kind of transparency foundation in place, at least not yet. We are worlds away from where they are already today. The European process for collecting goods-level emissions intensity information is going to start being deployed in October under the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. They'll collect that data for a much smaller basket of goods than the Prove It Act will cover. And so they're going to be developing a data foundation on the carbon intensity of, I'll give the list again, iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminum, electricity, hydrogen. The Prove It Act covers a much broader basket of goods, so we'll have a greater understanding of the relative carbon intensity there. The Prove It Act is also designed to partner with other governments on developing data reporting techniques and sort of normalizing those accounting methods needed to get from facilities to goods themselves. So we're also going to be sort of leveling up the rest of the world as we go. The EU CBAM, it's for internal purposes. It's to understand their internal CBAM. Much less emphasis on improving data collection and quality worldwide.
All right, so we're about at an hour. So
Yep.
Thank you all, friends. Good luck with your lobby sessions. Get those signatures.